Tonight's story isn't about Roman triumphs, not the smooth stones of the Appian Way, or the orderly columns of a temple rising above a conquered city. It's about the places Rome couldn't map, the people who didn't submit, the edges of the empire where legions went in and didn't come out, places where the trees don't speak Latin, where roads don't lead to Rome, and where history whispers. This isn't the history of marble, it's the history of moss, of silence, and of survival. So before you drift off, feel free to like this video if it earns it, and subscribe if you'd like more slow journeys into the past. Now, take a breath, let the world around you fade, and imagine a time when even Rome had a boundary it couldn't cross. Welcome to the story of the tribe Rome couldn't crush. Imagine waking before the sun, not to an alarm, not to the clang of metal or the sound of voices in a busy street. There is no marketplace outside, no forum, no villa, no walls at all really. Just the sound of wind slipping through tall grasses, the crackling hush of leaves shifting in the treetops, and the weight of stillness all around you. There are no roads here, no aqueducts, no marble columns rising from tiled courtyards, no polished bronze busts of emperors reminding you who rules the world. You are not a Roman. You are one of the ones Rome never understood. And this land, your home, is one they never truly touched. Your shelter is low, warm, almost hidden, part dwelling, part memory, built not to impress but to blend, made of bark, mud, sinew, and patience. Smoke curls gently from a notch in the roof, not from luxury, but necessity. The fire must be kept alive through the night, every night. Without it, you would not wake to warmth, only cold, damp air that seeps into bones and stays there. You rise slowly, quietly. No one speaks first thing in the morning. There's no need. The tasks ahead are not debated or planned. They are known. They're not listed or written, just remembered. The same rhythms repeated across generations. Chop the wood, check the traps, gather the roots, mend the nets. You step outside. The ground is soft and cool beneath your feet. The forest breathes with you. Mist clings to the undergrowth, rising slowly like spirits returning home. You inhale. The scent is rich and familiar. Wet bark, damp moss, old smoke, and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. It's not pleasant in the way Roman perfumes might be. It's grounding, earthy, real. There is no town square, no gossip to exchange, no magistrate to fear or flatter. Just your kin, your tribe, those who live by the same unwritten rules, who know the same signs in the sky, who hear the same messages in the rustling trees, and beyond them, deeper in the forest, the unknown. This world is not ruled. It is watched. You don't control the land. You listen to it. The trees shift with seasons you don't mark with calendars. The animals move in patterns you learn not from books, but from years spent crouching, waiting, mimicking silence itself. And when you hear the crack of a branch that doesn't belong, a footstep where none should be, your entire body knows before your mind catches up. You crouch, you vanish, you become part of the forest again. This land doesn't belong to Rome. It never did. It doesn't obey orders shouted in Latin, or lines drawn on maps in distant halls. It only listens to those who have listened to it. And today, it whispers the same thing it always has. The empire ends here. Your clothes carry no color that shines. There's no dye shipped in from the Phoenician coast. No flowing white linen bleached in the sun. Instead, you wear the landscape. Your tunic is rough hide, tanned by hand, soaked in smoke. and softened by time. The skins come from animals you've known, tracked, caught, used, thanked. Nothing is wasted. Bones become tools. Sinew becomes thread. Fat becomes balm. The designs etched into your garments aren't for beauty, but for memory. Each mark holds meaning. The bend of a river, the bite of a winter, the name of a fallen brother. You carry your stories stitched into your sleeves. There are no mirrors here. You don't know your face the way Romans do, but you know your own shadow. You know how you move in silence. You know how your shape disappears into tall grass or merges with a rock when danger nears. You were taught not by tutors, but by the land itself. You know which leaf stings and which leaf heals. You know the roots that numb pain and the ones that bring sleep. And deeper knowledge still. How to find them in winter. How to take without damaging. How to leave a forest unscarred. There are no books in your village, but your knowledge is deep. Oral, yes, but not fragile. Repeated, retold, re-remembered at the fire, at the birth of a child, at the passing of an elder. And when your people speak of the empire, it's not with awe, but with caution. Rome is a whisper in the trees, a rumor of metal and fire. You've seen their scouts, rarely, and only from a distance. They wear plates that gleam, carry long weapons, and speak in clipped, strange sounds. But they don't move like your hunters. They don't read the ground. They step too loudly. They breathe too heavily. And most of all, they think they're safe when they are not. Your people don't challenge them, not directly. You watch, you wait, you learn their paths. You know where they rest, where they think the forest ends. But the forest never ends. Not really. And in time, they stop coming. Or they come with more men, more armor, more noise. But it doesn't help. Because this place doesn't care how many banners they carry. It doesn't bow to discipline or columns. It swallows the unprepared. It punishes pride. And so your life continues, without empire, without coin, without conquest. Just roots, rituals, and the knowledge that the land doesn't need defending, only understanding. There is no calendar in your home, no carved stone marking the passage of months. Yet you know the season has turned, not because someone told you, but because the birds changed their calls and the wind shifted its scent. Time, for you, is measured in migrations and mushrooms, in how the river swells after a storm, in the thickness of the deer's coat, in the hardness of the ground when you kneel to drink. Your people do not count hours. They notice light, how it angles through the branches, how long it takes the sun to touch the western ridge. This too is survival, not through force, but through rhythm. And that rhythm is never still. You work, always. But the work is quiet, repetitive. Braiding traps, sharpening stone, binding wood. Your hands move even while your eyes watch the trees. Every movement has a reason. The smoke from your fire is shaped, thin and cold-colored, so that it won't rise too high. Your paths are changed every week, never forming trails. Even the way you speak, soft, close, almost whispered, is shaped by generations of living where being heard could mean being found. Because somewhere out there, Rome is listening. They don't understand your language. They write about you in fragments, usually filtered through fear. To them, your people are shadows. Figures that appear on ridgelines and disappear without trace. They build roads in straight lines, and you break them, not with war, but with moss, mud, and time. They plant standards in soil they think they've claimed, and the forest takes them back. This is not a rebellion. It's not even a war. It's something slower, something Rome never knew how to fight. Its knowledge passed in murmurs, its patience measured in generations, its survival in its oldest, quietest form. And though you may not speak of it this way, what you're doing is resistance. You preserve ways the empire cannot absorb, not because you hate it, but because you remember something older than it. Your gods do not sit on thrones. They are in the trees, in the fire, in the silence between footsteps. And your warriors, they don't wear titles, they don't march, they vanish. And when they return, they carry news, sometimes food, sometimes silence. You don't tell stories of glorious conquest. You tell stories of returning home, of remembering which tree marks the edge of the safe path, of surviving winter without being seen. The Empire knows nothing of this world, and it never will. If you were Roman, you might look at this place and see what's missing. No stone walls, no coinage, no hierarchy of senators, clients, slaves, no statues, no grand feasts, no Latin carved into marble or chanted in temples. But if you're from here, this last unconquered land, you see none of that as lacking. You see a different kind of wealth. You see the trail of deer prints that weren't there yesterday. You see the color of the leaves, just slightly duller than last week, a sign of storms to come. You see the way smoke rises differently when someone is nearby, watching. You live in a world Rome doesn't believe exists, because it can't control it. Your leaders are chosen not for birthright or power, but for memory. Who remembers the river's flood season? Who remembers which plant can save a child from fever? Who remembers what happened last time Romans came close? There are no written records, but every wrinkle on an elder's face is a page. Every scar is a story, and every silence is deliberate. You know how to vanish, not just from sight, but from memory. Your tribe has no single name in Roman records. Sometimes you're called those who live behind the ridge, sometimes ghosts, sometimes nothing at all. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful form of resistance. Rome cannot conquer what it cannot define. It cannot rule what it cannot locate. It cannot destroy what it cannot understand. Your people move when they must, live simply, speak rarely, and endure endlessly. This is not a rebellion. This is a way of life, a slow, quiet, stubborn life, rooted deep into soil that doesn't care who wears the crown, that barely noticed when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or when legions marched across the Rhine. This land answers to no one, and so do you. And perhaps, without fanfare, without monuments, you've done what no kingdom ever did. You survived Rome. Rome, at its height, did not whisper. It spoke in marble, in aqueducts and arches, in orders barked by centurions across a continent. From Scotland's mists to the edge of the Red Sea, it told the world one thing. You are not outside Rome. You are beneath it. And yet, there were places where the roads ended, where the maps became vague, where the names were not written in Latin, but guessed in charcoal. Edges of the empire that refused to become its center. One such edge lay beyond the mountains, beyond the dense forests, the marshes, the rivers with names that tasted foreign on Roman tongues. It could be Germania, or Dacia, or the highlands of North Africa, or deeper still, somewhere the scrolls no longer name. And this edge bothered them, not just because it was untamed, but because it was unbowed. Where most enemies could be bribed, frightened, or absorbed, these people vanished. They didn't take treaties. They didn't take roads. They didn't take Rome. so Rome, of course, sent legions. The man in charge may have been a general, or an emperor himself. Perhaps it was Germanicus, ambitious, calculating, the adoptive son of power, draped in inherited pressure. Or Trajan, hardened by campaigns and the cold logic of empire. Or another, lesser remembered, whose name remains only in half-burned dispatches found in bogs. Whoever he was, he believed in victory. He spoke of order, of civilization, of bringing peace through conquest, as Romans always did. He studied his maps, spoke with interpreters, gathered intelligence from scouts who had never seen more than the tree line. He saw the absence of cities, of citadels, of proper fields, and mistook it for weakness. He read about the land, but not enough. He knew the weather could be harsh, but not that it could turn in an afternoon. He knew the terrain was uneven, but not that it devoured formations whole. Still, he ordered the march. The soldiers packed as they always did. Standard rations, standard gear, standard confidence. And then they crossed the last known river. From here, there were no more paved roads, just game trails and damp silence. The underbrush thickened, the birds fell quiet, and the empire began to stretch thin. They moved deeper, toward a people who had no written name, toward a land that did not care for empires. And as they moved, the trees closed behind them. The line of soldiers was long, too long. They moved like they always had, a column of order, disciplined, drilled, shields strapped to backs, spears in hand, eyes ahead. But the forest didn't care. It broke their line every mile. Bent trees forced detours. Boggy stretches swallowed boots whole. Vines pulled at armor straps, and insects droned in thick clouds, loud enough to smother thought. Still, they marched. The commander, high on his horse, or maybe borne on a litter, tried to maintain the illusion of control. He sent scouts ahead. They vanished. He sent messages back. The runners didn't return. The men grumbled, quietly at first. They spoke of curses, of ghost tribes, of stories told by auxiliaries who claimed this land wasn't meant to be walked by men from the south. One night, a hound refused to move forward. It whined, ears flat, and curled itself beneath a wagon, trembling. They beat it, then left it behind. The next morning, the hound was gone. But so was a sentry. Still, the order came. March on. The forest narrowed. What was once a wide corridor of trees became a funnel. Visibility dropped. The undergrowth rose to their waists, and the paths began to shift, no longer moving straight, but curving, doubling back, like the land itself was turning them around. They passed strange markers. Bones hung from branches, figures made of twigs and feathers, swaying where there was no wind. Some said they were warnings. Others said they were just tricks, primitives trying to scare an empire. And still, they marched. Rations ran low faster than expected. The streams were muddy. Rain fell and didn't stop. Their fires became smoke and mud. Armor rusted at the seams. There were no battles, no glorious charges, just attrition. They began to find signs of something watching them. Scratches on trees, too high to be human. Strange footprints, too small or too wide, or walking in patterns that made no sense. The forest was speaking, but Rome didn't understand its language. One morning, they found the rear guard gone. No signs of struggle, just missing. The commander blamed deserters, but the men knew the forest was thinning them. one by one. A war without swords. And still, he ordered them forward. Because Rome does not retreat. The days became hard to count. The forest filtered the sun into a pale, constant glow. No true dawn, no clean dusk. Just a haze of time that stretched like fog. Discipline frayed, formations dissolved. Cohorts that once drilled with perfect timing now stumbled through brush and bog. Shields became burdens. Helmets, traps for heat and insects. Rations were halved, then quartered. Boiling roots replaced grain. Hunting parties returned with less each time, sometimes nothing at all. Men began to mumble prayers, not to Roman gods, but to household spirits, to old gods from the hills, to anything that might see them through. The commander, whoever he was, grew isolated. He rode less, walked more. His orders came more slowly. He barked less and listened more, to the woods, because the silence was growing. No bird calls, no insects, just wind and footsteps, and occasionally something else. Rustling where no one walked, faint cracks of movement just beyond torchlight. Whispers, or something like whispers, in a language no one spoke. At night, men lit fires they were told not to. Flames danced high against orders, but they needed the light. They needed something familiar. The fires felt like home, but the fires also marked them, and the forest took note. One night, one of the sentries disappeared mid-watch. Then a second, then a third, found at dawn, eyes open, mouth full of leaves, as if the forest itself had entered him. Panic brewed beneath the surface. Rome trained its legions to face men, to build camps, to siege cities. But this was different. There was no enemy in formation, no banners, no horns, just a presence, patient, methodical, indifferent to glory. The commander changed strategy. He ordered more scouts, more fire, more boldness. It made no difference. Each patrol returned with fewer men, or not at all. And yet, they pushed forward. Because to stop was to admit defeat. To turn back was to face Rome's shame. And to go on. Well, to go on was to hope that there was something ahead. A village to conquer, a king to subdue, a moment to declare victory. But there was nothing ahead, only more trees, and something behind them that never quite stopped following. The men no longer slept deeply. Each night, they took turns standing watch, not out of discipline, but out of fear. Even in pairs they whispered, afraid to speak above the wind. The campfires grew smaller, surrounded by rings of sharpened stakes, as if wood could stop what was coming. And still, men vanished. Sometimes there were no signs. Sometimes a line of blood stretching into the trees. Sometimes something else. A charm made of bone and grass, hanging from a branch above the empty bedroll. One soldier, older, from the northern provinces, said it was the mark of the tree watchers. His mother had spoken of them. Forest spirits, he said. Not gods, not men, just watchers. And they didn't like fire. The younger men laughed at him, but not for long, because laughter was leaving them. What was once a proud force, a full legion, perhaps more, was thinning. Some from death, some from desertion, some from madness. They stopped singing marching songs, stopped sharpening armor, stopped talking about home. The trees had grown thicker, closer. Branches leaned down over their camp like arms. Even the horses were restless, eyes wide, legs trembling. One morning, the commander ordered a retreat. He would never call it that, of course. He spoke of strategic withdrawal, of regrouping. But the men understood. They were turning around. But the forest had changed behind them. Paths that had brought them in were gone. Rivers flowed in new directions. The moss grew on all sides of the trees, no longer pointing north. They built litters for the wounded. Half their supplies were gone. The rest were hoisted onto exhausted backs. The march home was slow, too slow. And now, at last, they saw them. Not clearly, not in daylight, not with certainty, but in glimpses, figures, tall and thin, moving silently between trees, watching, always watching. They never charged, never spoke, just waited. And that was worse, because the legionaries had been trained for battle, not for fear. And in the quiet moments, when the fire burned low, when the branches creaked, when the mist curled close to the ground, even the veterans admitted it. This wasn't a war. This was a punishment, not for failure, but for pride, for thinking the world ended at the borders of the known, for thinking the map was the territory, for thinking the forest was empty, just because it was quiet. The first ambush wasn't like the ones they'd trained for. There were no arrows whistling from above, no shouting, no horns, no charge of warriors from the brush. Just one man, a young soldier, gone between one breath and the next. He had been speaking, telling a story from home, half smiling. And then, he wasn't there. His gear remained. His footprint stopped. The space where he'd stood became empty, like it had never held a person at all. The rest stood still, listening. But the trees said nothing, and the silence grew louder than any battle. The commander, eyes sunken, lips chapped, tried to keep order. He walked among the men at night now, whispering reassurance. His voice was calm, but his eyes were always on the trees. He issued new orders. Move in tighter formation, and still, they were hunted. Not openly, not in numbers, but slowly, patiently. At first, it was the rear guard. Then, a pair of messengers. Then, a cook who stepped away to gather herbs and never came back. The missing weren't replaced. They were simply forgotten. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because to name them was to remember they were real. And that was too painful now. More and more, the commander was left alone. His officers dead or lost. His strategies meaningless. What do you do when the land itself is your enemy? The roads had never been built here. Rome had laid no foundation. The empire's weight, its stones, its roads, its rule, meant nothing to the trees. Even the animals avoided them now. And in that quiet, deeper than death, heavier than defeat, a new fear settled in, that this place had never been meant for them, that they had never been welcome, that they would not be remembered, not with honor, not with inscriptions, not with statues on marble plinths, only as a whisper, a warning, an echo of boots lost in mud, rusted iron, and the hush of green shadows. The map had been drawn in haste. Rivers sketched in ink that bled through parchment. Mountains rendered as jagged lines. Forests reduced to harmless clusters of green. The commander unfolded it again, hands shaking, not from age, but from knowledge. The path they had taken in no longer matched anything on the map. Landmarks had shifted, distances warped. A trail that once took a day now stretched for 3. Men muttered that the forest was moving, that it was rearranging itself, twisting behind them, confusing their sense of direction. Others claimed the stars were wrong, that they no longer rose where they should. But one fact remained. The path home was gone, so they followed instinct, and instinct led them deeper. There were still signs of civilization, but they weren't Roman. A carved stone, half buried in moss, etched with symbols no one recognized. A ring of trees growing in perfect silence, each one scorched at the base. A pile of blackened Roman shields, neatly stacked in the hollow of a fallen trunk. One soldier swore he heard singing, not from far off, but close, behind his ear, inside the rustle of leaves. A woman's voice, he said. He wept when he spoke of it. That night, he disappeared. By now, there were barely enough men to form a defensive circle. They stopped building proper camps, stopped setting watches, stopped praying. Each morning, the survivors rose slower, thinner, less certain. They had left as soldiers. Now, they were wanderers. And even that title seemed generous. They no longer knew if they were walking in circles, or if the forest itself simply had no end. The commander walked among them silently now. His armor dented, his standard gone. He carried no sword, only a broken spear shaft, worn smooth from his grip. Once he was praised in Rome. Once he was promised triumph. He had stood in marble halls, sworn to bring peace to the wild. But now his peace was broken only by birds that didn't sing, and winds that never blew twice from the same direction. This was not defeat in the Roman sense. There had been no battle, no surrender, no treaty, just the soft sound of boots in wet leaves, and the creeping sense that they were not the first to walk this way. At some point, the records stop. There are no more reports, no more letters carried by trembling messengers, no updates to the Senate, no final scroll to be sealed and sent to Rome. The trail of the legion ends, not in battle, not in fire, but in absence. A gap in the official record. What we know comes from shadows, from a recovered journal, half burnt and buried in peat, from broken weapons found deep in regions Rome never settled, from local stories, told in strange dialects, of pale men who wandered like ghosts and never spoke again. Perhaps a few survived, crawled back to the edges of empire, silent, changed. But if they did, they never rose again. Their commander, once decorated, once praised, was never seen in Rome. There is no statue of him, no parade, no funeral, just one name, half scratched on a weather-worn inscription found miles from any known road. And even that name might not be his. For the locals, those who still speak of the old times, say the forest claimed them, not violently, not cruelly, simply, completely, as if the land itself had swallowed them whole, as if Rome had simply wandered into a place where it did not belong and was erased. This wasn't failure in the usual sense. It was something quieter, more total. The empire wasn't defeated. It was ignored, unwelcomed, unneeded. And in that absence, that refusal to acknowledge Rome's power, something unsettling happened. The greatest force the world had known simply disappeared. Years later, when Rome's scribes looked back on the campaign, they had little to work with. There were no monuments, no surviving spoils, no heroic tales passed down in taverns, just missing men, and a silence that Rome could not explain. The Senate asked questions. Commanders gave vague answers. They blamed weather, terrain, poor logistics, unreliable guides. But none dared say the obvious. that they had entered a place that would not be conquered, that the land itself had refused empire. A few surviving soldiers, those who made it back, scattered and ragged, spoke little. They didn't describe a final stand or heroic defense. They described dreams, sounds, a sense of being watched. One man carved a phrase into the wall of a grain store before disappearing again. The trees remember. Some scholars dismissed them as mad, others wondered. Tacitus wrote of forests that consume men, of tribes that vanish and return, of places where Rome ends not with resistance, but with forgetting. And so, this story became a gap, a fold in the parchment, a strange note in the back of a campaign log. Rome conquered the known world, but not this. Not the nameless jungle, not the veiled mountain pass, not the cold highlands or whispering woods, not the people who didn't wait to be found. And so the campaign passed from memory into mystery. And what remained? A broken spear shaft, buried deep beneath layers of leaf mold. A Roman coin found miles from the nearest road, blackened by fire. And a story passed down through generations, never written, never proven. A story of a forest that does not forgive, and of an empire that, for all its might, was not immune to being forgotten. It begins with a hole in the record, not a contradiction, not a dispute, but an absence. No ruins, no shattered temples, no buried villas or crumbling aqueducts overtaken by moss. Not even the usual scars of conflict, the burnt villages, the half-finished roads, the Latin inscriptions on stone. Just silence. Archaeologists call it a negative footprint, an area that should show signs of occupation, but doesn't. A blank spot where, according to Roman records, there should have been conquest, garrisons, markets, tombs. Instead, they found tree roots, layer after layer of undisturbed soil, no coins, no pottery, no bones, except a few odd things. One dig, deep in a valley near what was once a Roman frontier, uncovered a single iron nail, bent at an angle inconsistent with standard Roman construction. Another found what appeared to be the base of a spear, burned almost beyond recognition, lodged in the hollow of a tree long dead. Elsewhere, a pit of sharpened stakes, deliberately buried. Animal bones arranged in strange circular patterns. And in one bog preserved by the cold, acidic water, the fragment of a Roman sandal, with no foot inside it. The surrounding cultures, Germanic, Illyrian, Berber, Scythian, all left their marks, but not this group. The forest kept their secrets, and to some scholars, that was the first clue. Because what if this was the legacy? What if the absence was intentional? A way of life not meant to be carved in stone, but passed in silence, in migration, in disappearance. The people Rome could not conquer may also be the people who refused to be remembered. Not because they were simple, but because they were watching, listening, and choosing. Sometimes to learn about a people who left no record, you have to listen to the ones who stood nearby, not Rome. Rome spoke of barbarians and wildlands. Their words were useful for politics, not for truth, but the tribes at the edges, the ones who traded, fought, and vanished. They left stories. In the northern forests, among old Germanic clans, a tale was passed down of men with roots instead of feet, not trees but people, who walked without leaving tracks, who melted into the woods before a shadow could fall across them. In the high Caucasus, herders whispered about fire women, strangers with red-painted eyes, seen only once at dusk, who sang to storms and were gone by dawn. In the Atlas Mountains, Berber oral histories speak of those who walk backwards into the hills, never revealing their faces, never staying long, but always watching. These stories are fragmented. They shift with retellings. Are they myth? Are they metaphor? Maybe. But sometimes myth is just memory, softened by time. And in these memories, we see a pattern. Not warriors who rode into open battle, not kings who built thrones of stone, but ghosts, figures who refuse to be captured by armies or by stories, who never settled in one place long enough for Rome to strike, and still they linger, not in writing, but in the gaps, in the places where Roman influence fades, not from distance, but from refusal. And maybe, just maybe, those stories tell us more than any tablet could, because they suggest something strange, that the people Rome never conquered chose not to be found. It's a challenge, studying a people who left no cities, no archives, no statuary or named gods. But sometimes something appears, not in obvious places, not near settlements or along trade routes, but in the margins, high ridges, remote bogs, valleys no Roman ever entered. And what's found there is rarely what you expect. There's a shard of obsidian, volcanic glass, found hundreds of miles from the nearest volcano. It had been shaped, but not in a Roman style. No Latin etching, no symbols of empire, just grooves fitted to a human palm, for a grip that was likely used, not displayed. There's a fragment of cloth woven from fibers that don't match those used by neighboring tribes. It was dyed, not brightly, but with earthy reds and purples, tones meant to disappear into bramble and shadow. Then there's the bone, not human, but carefully carved, smooth and narrow. It was probably a whistle, but the tone it produced didn't match any known scale. When replicated by researchers, it made a soft, breathy note, somewhere between a bird call and a whisper. Not something to entertain, something to signal, possibly to warn. Most curious of all was the helmet. Roman by its shape, curved cheek plates, iron ridge, corroded badly, but over its surface were fine etchings, not Latin, not any known script, just lines, organic, swirling, like vines or river paths. And inside the helmet, a tuft of animal fur, carefully wrapped in plant fiber, deliberately placed. No one knows what it meant. A ritual, a trophy, a message. Perhaps the point is not the object, but the act. Something taken, transformed, made unrecognizable. Rome left its imprint in stone, but this tribe perhaps left its imprint in transformation, in using what the empire brought and turning it into something un-Roman, something unknowable, a quiet answer to conquest, not with armies, but with absence. Walk far enough into certain places, into stretches of woodland no road ever reached, and you may notice something. The silence isn't empty, it's layered. A rustle that isn't wind, a pattern in the way the trees lean, a rhythm in how light filters through the canopy, slow, deliberate, older than language. These are not random woods. They are cultivated, not cleared, not farmed, but shaped in ways only a few still recognize. Tree rings in deliberate formations, patches of undergrowth with strange uniformity, stone piles grown over with moss, placed in repeating intervals. Too intentional to be natural, too subtle to be Roman. This wasn't wilderness. It was a landscape known deeply, mapped in memory, passed down not in scrolls, but in footsteps. Even today, satellite imaging has revealed anomalies. Linear clearings that never became roads. Regular spacing between trees in areas with no record of agriculture. Circles, perfect, wide, empty, as if something once stood there. Or nothing ever dared to grow. Some anthropologists now suggest the people Rome couldn't conquer may have cultivated the wild itself, not to control it, but to live within it. They didn't burn the forest to build cities. They folded into it, became indistinguishable from it. The land didn't resist Rome. It simply didn't receive it. And in doing so, it protected those who called it home. Rome, for all its reach, never knew how to read a forest like that. To them, it was chaos. But to those who lived there, every root was a road, every tree a marker, every shadow a message. The land remains unconquered, unmapped, unwritten, and through it, so do they. Some archaeologists have a theory, not proven, not widely accepted, but quietly compelling, that what we think of as missing history was intentional, that the people who lived beyond Rome's reach had practices designed to leave no lasting mark, that their homes were meant to rot, their tools meant to return to earth, their rituals meant to fade. No stone, no gold, no scripts, only materials that dissolved with time, only structures that vanished within a generation, only songs that stopped when the last voice fell silent, not because they lacked sophistication, but because permanence wasn't the goal. This wasn't poverty, it was philosophy. In Rome, everything was built to last, to declare presence, to conquer time as well as space. Temples outlived the men who prayed in them. Statues bore faces long after their owners turned to dust. Every brick laid in the empire was a statement, we were here, but for this other world, the one Rome could not enter. The statement was different. We were here, but we left no trace. We live, but not for your history. You may walk where we walked, but you'll never find us. And maybe that was the point. A kind of power that didn't need monuments. A resistance that wasn't made of weapons. Just the quiet choice to be unrecorded. To survive, not in books, but in the trees. In stories carried by wind. In a silence so complete, it outlasted the empire itself. And in that silence, a deeper voice seems to speak. You cannot own what refuses to be seen. There are no surviving chronicles from this tribe, no annals, no genealogies, no written myths. But in the surrounding regions, in the places Rome brushed but did not fully rule, strange stories survived. In the hills of Illyria, old women once spoke of a tribe who lived without names. Each person had a song, not a title. And when they died, the song was buried with them, never sung again. In the steppes beyond the Danube, hunters whispered of a people who walked in silence, who never used firelight after dusk, and whose eyes reflected green, like the trees. In the forests north of the Black Sea, there was a tale of those who passed without passing, figures who moved like smoke, who left no trail except frost on branches, and whose presence could only be known once they were gone. Some of these stories are clearly metaphor. Others feel like memory. They speak of rituals too old to trace, of bone flutes played in fog, of feasts with no speaking, of children who were raised without ever seeing a Roman. They hint at beliefs, not in gods who ruled from above, but in ancestors who listened from the roots below. A faith rooted in place, in rhythm, in vanishing. And always, always. The stories agree on one thing. These people could not be captured. Not just in war, but in thought. They didn't fit Rome's categories. Not civilized, not savage. Not client state, not rebel. They were something else. Something Rome couldn't absorb, and therefore had to forget. Yet the stories remain, told in low voices, around fires, when the wind is high. Not history, but something close, something older. In a museum drawer, rarely shown, rarely studied, there's an object listed simply as carved bone, origin unknown. It was found in the 19th century during a peat excavation, hundreds of miles from the nearest Roman site, buried with no other artifacts, alone. It's not large, fits in the hand. A long, pale sliver of animal bone, possibly deer, smooth at the edges with incisions. Not decorative, not script. They are lines, curved, crisscrossed. Some intersect. Some stop abruptly. Others loop back and trace themselves. At first, scholars believed it was a tally, a calendar, a shamanic tool. But under closer analysis, the spacing of the lines matches the terrain around the excavation site. Rivers, ridges, elevations. In short, a map, but not like Rome's maps. Not a projection from above, neat and mathematical. This one feels lived in. The bends match walking paths. The loops match ritual clearings. The interrupted lines match cliffs where only birds travel. And there's something stranger still. A series of indentations barely visible. Pressed into the bone, not scratched. At first, thought to be wear marks, but patterned. A tactile code, perhaps dash. Meant to be read by touch, not sight. By someone moving, someone listening. If it is a map, it's not one to guide invaders. It's one to guide insiders. Those who already know the forest and simply need reminders. A curve here, a shelter there. It may be the only surviving object, made by the tribe Rome never conquered. That actually explains anything. But it doesn't speak in language. It speaks in presence. And in doing so, it honors the legacy of its makers. Not to declare power, not to build empire, but to move unseen and to return home. What do we call a people with no buildings? No language we can read, no tombs, no idols, no heroes carved in stone. Some say they vanished. Others say they never truly existed. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere quieter. In the rustling of leaves where no roads go. In the chill that settles when you step too deep into woods still unnamed. Because something remains. Not in the record. Not in the archives. But in the space just outside Rome's reach. A rhythm that doesn't fit the empire's drum. A way of being that doesn't want to be remembered. Only to continue. There are places in the world where no empire ever ruled, not because they lacked the strength, but because they lacked the language. This tribe, whoever they were, spoke in silence, built with breath and bone and wind, and when Rome came, they didn't fight like armies. They didn't surrender like cities. They simply weren't there anymore. They let the land speak for them. And the land remains. So if you walk far enough, past the last milestone, beyond where the maps end, you might find a forest that doesn't remember your name, but remembers theirs. Back in Rome, in the marbled halls and candle-lit libraries, Men wrote of many things, of gods, of laws, of war, and of the edge of the world, not often, not in detail, but just enough to hint at something that unsettled them. Tacitus, ever the careful observer, spoke of forests that consume men, of tribes who live without boundary or king, of lands where Rome's presence becomes thin and then disappears altogether. Pliny the Elder compiled reports from merchants and scouts. His descriptions grow vague beyond a certain point. He uses words like unknown, unmapped, suspected. Even Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on Gaul, spared little ink for those deep in the forests, not for lack of interest, but perhaps because there was so little to grasp. In Roman literature, the further from Rome one travels, the less defined the people become. Names blur, descriptions repeat, and fear takes the place of knowledge. These were not peoples to be studied or admired. They were warnings. They were cautionary tales told to generals and children alike, not because they were strong, but because they could not be contained. The empire thrived on order dash, on cities aligned to the sun, on roads that cut straight through hills, on rules that reached from the capital to the edge of empire. But here, at the edge, Rome saw something else. A people without coins, without tribute, without ambition to expand, and that frightened them more than any army ever did. Because you can kill a threat, but you cannot kill an idea. And this idea, that someone could live without Rome, was dangerous. In the city at the center of the world, there were rumors that certain altars were built for gods with no names, placed not in grand temples, but tucked into corners, behind shrines, at the edges of gardens where olive trees grew crooked. Altars not to Jupiter or Mars, but to whatever lived beyond. Offerings of wine poured at dusk, whispers in languages long forgotten, or invented just to placate what Roman law could not reach. Superstition, perhaps, or something deeper. Some senators kept charms on their person, not Roman amulets, but carved bits of antler, traded from the north, said to ward off the curse of the wild. There were festivals too, private ones, rites not recorded on the public calendar, observed by patricians who had served near the frontier and returned changed. They spoke less, laughed more softly, and looked toward the hills when the wind changed. One record, found in the margins of a household account book, speaks of offering wheat to the Dark Ones each autumn equinox. Another describes a nobleman who refused to eat meat. That came from animals raised near unseen lands. Even the language shifted to describe something unknowable. Romans would say it came from the green mouth, or that it was marked by root and claw, or simply from where the roads forget. These weren't official policies. They weren't doctrine. They were habits, reflexes, superstitions passed down in whisper. Because even at the height of their empire, Rome knew there were limits, not geographical, but spiritual. Places where law had no weight, where empire had no voice, where memory itself grew silent, and the people who lived in those places were not to be spoken of too loudly. In every classroom, every scroll, every speech before the Senate, Rome painted itself as eternal, a world without rivals, a system without alternative. But the silences tell another story. In all its records, its battle accounts, tax logs, censuses, there are blank spaces, margins left empty, regions under observation, tribes not fully pacified, And in those spaces lived the unconquered. Rome defined itself through power. So what did it mean when power failed? The answer was omission. Better to say nothing than to admit defeat. Better to call them shadows, phantoms, or spirits than to admit there were people who simply said no. Not in rebellion, not in blood, just no. No to tribute, no to roads, no to being seen. And so they weren't. They vanished from the empire's gaze, but not from the land, not from the memory of those who truly looked. And maybe that is the strangest victory of all, to win not by fighting, but by slipping beyond the reach of history itself. So now you know a story most never hear, not because it was hidden, but because it was never written. A people Rome couldn't name, a place Rome couldn't tame, a silence too deep for stone to hold. They left no walls, no scrolls, no graves marked with epitaphs, and yet they endured in the folds of the forest, in the fear beneath empire's confidence, in the stories that survived not in libraries but in the breath of those who still walk their paths. Rome built roads that reached across continents, but there were places those roads stopped. And sometimes, at the end of the road, there was a forest. And in that forest, a people who didn't conquer and weren't conquered. They simply remained. Now, as the lights around you fade, as the present returns, remember this: power leaves marks, but absence leaves questions. And sometimes, it's the unanswered stories